Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending today's federal election town hall meeting, co-organized by SUCCESS and CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. I'm Justin McElroy, CBC's Vancouver's Municipal Affairs reporter. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which these organizations are both headquartered are on the traditional and unceded territory of Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We have a limited amount of time this afternoon and want to ensure that a meaningful discussion can take place. Let's begin by hearing first from Terry Young, the board chair of SUCCESS.
Thank you, Justin. I'm delighted to join CIJA, our partner for this town hall. I want to thank Nico and Eddie from CIJA, and Queenie, Ryan, Connie, and Jean from SUCCESS. I also want to thank Justin McElroy as MC, and I also want to thank all of you, over 100 participants today, taking your time off a busy day to learn about our candidates and their platforms to make an informed decision. And above all, I want to thank the candidates who stepped up here today, put your name on the ballot to be part of our democracy here in Canada. And lastly, but more importantly, I want to talk to the participants today. Your vote matters. Think of people around the world who may not have the right to vote. So we must exercise this right carefully and diligently. So please do not forget to vote and have a good town hall. Thank you, Justin.
Based on the qualifications set out by the Federal Leaders Debate Commission for the federal debate last week, the co-organizers of this town hall chose the following 4 political parties with candidates in British Columbia. Those parties are the Green Party of Canada, the Conservative Party of Canada, the Liberal Party of Canada, and the New Democratic Party. Members of the public were invited to submit questions to the candidates relating to 6 major themes. The questions were submitted until September 9th. Based on topics, the co-organizers of the town hall have sorted through the questions, and 2 questions per theme were selected and will be posed to the candidates. These themes were chosen based on priorities of both CIJA and SUCCESS and are important to the diverse communities they serve. The themes are racism and hate crimes, seniors care, post-pandemic economic recovery, immigrants and refugees, healthy and safe communities, and the sustainability of charitable organizations and nonprofit organizations. Each candidate will get 2 minutes to address the 2 questions in their first response. Then there will be a follow-up opportunity for each candidate to speak for another minute on the topic. Regarding the speaking order, a random draw completed beforehand determined the order that candidates will get to answer a question first. And once a full rotation is completed, we will start from the beginning again. Format is meant to be a discussion and for candidates to share their views, which is code for candidates to remember this is not a debate. After all of these themes have been addressed, 2 questions from the media will be allowed and will be posed to the candidates in the last 10 minutes of this event. Moving on to our candidates, please allow me to introduce each of them briefly and tell you a little bit about them as provided by their campaign offices. Nick Loughton is the Green Party of Canada candidate for the Victoria riding. Nick was born and raised in Victoria, and he is proud to call this place his home. His core values are service, compassion, and justice. Nick's experience living with type 1 diabetes since childhood has led him to pursue a career in medicine and in biomedical research, where he worked for several years developing nano-vaccines to treat advanced breast cancers. Later on, Nick attended law school at UVic. He believes that Canada must change the course on climate change and on growing inequality and access to healthcare for Nick, and the consequences of inaction will be felt for generations. Welcome, Nick. Kenny Chiu is the Conservative Party of Canada candidate for the Steveston-Richmond East riding. Kenny Chiu is a Richmond community advocate of over 25 years. He immigrated from Canada from Hong Kong in 1989, but his love for this country stems from experiences since 1982 as an international student in the Canadian prairies. He remains proud that Canada is the only country he's held citizenship in and has been married for over 25 years. He is the father of 2 daughters born and raised in Richmond and is also the loving adoptive father of Nugget, a Havanese Maltese poodle. Welcome, Kenny. Joyce Murray is the Liberal Party of Canada candidate for the Vancouver Quadra riding. The Honourable Joyce Murray was first elected as the Liberal Member of Parliament for Vancouver Quadra in 2008, following a highly successful 25-year career building an international reforestation company and 4 years in the provincial cabinet of the BC government. She was appointed Minister of Digital Government on November 20th, 2019. She also championed and helped lead the development of the Center for Greening Government. She is passionate about investing in a fair, greener economy that empowers future generations. Welcome, Joyce. And finally, Peter Julian is the New Democratic Party of candidate for the New Westminster Burnaby riding. Peter was born and raised in the New Westminster Burnaby area, where his family has lived for 4 generations. After graduating from New Westminster Secondary School, Peter worked as a manual laborer and factory worker. He has a degree in political science from the University of Quebec in Montreal, and since being elected in 2004 as an MP, Peter has assisted over 20,000 people in the riding. As House Leader, Peter took on the role of Chief Negotiator for the federal NDP caucus in the 43rd Parliament for all of the COVID-related programs and legislation. Welcome, Peter. Candidates, please note that the answering for each topic will rotate during each category. The first one, as we've discussed, is on racism and hate crimes. Communities across Canada continue to see public displays of racist or bigoted behavior, from the distribution of racist flyers, to slurs often used and captured on social media, to graffiti, physical assault, and even death threats. First question is, what is the single most important action your party would take to combat racism, bigotry, and hate crimes, and your support of targeted communities as a member of Parliament? And what do you think is the best approach to tackling online hate? As discussed with the candidates beforehand, we will start with Kenny Chiu. Kenny, you have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you. This is not something, hate and discrimination, it's not something that that is unfamiliar to me. Personally, I recall knocking on many doors, and there was one particular one that actually shouted at me, and before I was able to open my mouth, point a finger at me and said, "It's all you people's fault." We know racism exists, discrimination exists in Canada. As the incumbent MP for Steveston Richmond East, I have a record in promoting community safety and standing against racism and hate crimes in our community. I have visited with the victims of incidents and connected with the RCMP to seek reassurance that a high quality of investigation and care is provided. In Richmond, especially in the past year, we have experienced an uptick of those hate crimes, and as an opposition member, I have also stood in the House of Commons multiple times and written to ministers seeking answers and actions from our government against anti-Semitism, hate crimes, and for the safety of our community. The Conservative Party, when formed government, will double our funding for security infrastructure program. We will also simplify the application process and remove the need to demonstrate risk, which often means that an institution has to experience a hate-motivated crime before being eligible for the crime itself, for the program itself. We will also allow funding to be used for a broader list of expenses, such as paying for security guards and training volunteers. We will also combat online hatred by criminalizing incitement of violence while keeping steps to protect forms of speech, criticism, and argument that do not encourage violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. Next up is Joyce Murray. Joyce.
Well, thank you very much. And first, I want to say thank you to SUCCESS and to CIJA for putting the effort into organizing this town hall for your constituencies and to hear from all of us. So the single most important action our party would take, I think that it is our plan to host a national action plan on combating hate, because this is a very complex issue and there are many things that will be needed to be done, and we will need to hear from all of the communities that are affected by racism and hate crimes. So that's one. I would say that we have already done a lot in terms of our anti-racism strategy, National Summit on Anti-Semitism, National Summit on Islamophobia, We've tackled racism and hate already, but there is much more to do. How will we support communities? We'll establish actually a national support fund for survivors of hate-motivated crimes to help them with uninsured costs, mental health, physiotherapy, medical equipment, and so on. And what is the best approach for tackling online hate is, well, we already tabled Bill 36, which would amend the Human Rights Act to define a new discriminatory practice of community hate speech online and provide remedies. So we take these issues really seriously. Canada has no room for the kind of racism and the hate crimes that we've been experiencing and that have increased recently, especially for the Asian community and the Muslim community over the past several years. Anti-Semitism is also a very important and long-term concern, and we have provided funding for mosques and for the Jewish communities, the places of worship, and we'll continue to support your communities fully as we go forward.
All right, thank you, Joyce. Next up is Peter Julian. Peter.
Hello, bonjour, shalom, ni man hao, da jia hao. Thank you for the invitation to speak today, and I am speaking to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Kakite First Nation and the Coast Salish peoples. This is a fundamentally important question. We've seen the rise in racism and hate. We've seen the rise of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, transphobia, homophobia, misogyny. This is something that takes action, not words. Now, Jagmeet Singh, as the first racialized leader of a political party, federal political party in Canada, knows this firsthand. And the NDP has a comprehensive approach that we have talked about over the last few months and put forward in our platform. We believe that we need to have federal government resources devoted to pushing back against hate. That means tracking incidences of hate as well as the attacks that are already often tracked through our police services. We need to make sure that we're empowering communities and empowering individuals to push back against hate. And that comprehensive strategy is something that needs to be present throughout the federal government. What's the best approach to tackling online hate? Well, it is making the online companies, the web giants, liable for often the vile material that they make accessible to people. And as far as supporting targeted communities, in my community of New Westminster and Burnaby, we have pushed back to make sure that there is a strong response anytime there is hate. I also want to say the NDP has tabled the Bill C-313, which would ban symbols of hate, most prominently the Nazi paraphernalia, a vile symbol of horrible genocide and the Holocaust, and yet is freely available to be sold and displayed in Canada. Other countries have banned those displays of those symbols. Canada needs to too.
All right, thank you, Peter. And finally, we'll go to Nick Loughton. Nick.
Thank you, Justin. I'm speaking to you today from the territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, now known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, here in what is called Victoria, British Columbia. The relationship continues with this land to this day, and it is with great respect that I continue to educate myself as I learn, live, work on this territory. Silence emboldens hate, and that silence has seen a rise in Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Asian and anti-Black hate, discrimination against LGBTQ2S+ folks and persons with disabilities in recent years. Annamie Paul, as the first Black Jewish woman to lead a major party in Canadian history, knows this all too well. There are a few things that the Green Party will do to address this. For starters, we have the calls to action, 94 calls to action from the TRC, which must be implemented. The calls to justice from the final report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We also have the recommendations from the UN Working Group on people of African descent. all of these implementation will work to address systemic discrimination in this country and will also work to lower hate crimes here. But that's not enough. See, online, what we have is platforms that allow hate to continue to be spread. The most effective way of removing hate from these platforms is to actually deplatform. Making distributors of content, whether they're social media giants or others, liable for the content that they allow to be published on their website, and banning hate speech most forcefully there is the most effective way that we can keep these people out of the space that allows them to continue to be hateful. And that hate must not be allowed to continue to fester in the Canadian society any longer. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nick. We now will allow each of the candidates to have a follow-up minute to discuss anything either they wanted to say that they didn't before or things that were sparked from the conversation from other candidates. We'll go in the same order for this question and the same order for each question going forward for this follow-up. And so we begin this time with Kenny.
Well, thank you. I need to remind everybody that while we look up to government, especially the federal government, for leadership and roles to play in our legislation, combating hate and discrimination, it's more than just a government role. We need to continue to work with our community partners, such as CIJA, such as SUCCESS, and then individually Canadians. We need to also open ourselves to work among ourselves through the media, through our schools and education system to build a better future. It is only through inoculation like that that we will be able to sufficiently and effectively combat hate. If hate can be eliminated by legislation, we should have done that, we would have done that. Unfortunately, it's in human nature, and we need to work together with many other stakeholders and partners in combating hate. And the federal government sounds like everybody is on page, and we will work together with all these stakeholders as a conservative government. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kenny. Joyce, on to you.
Thank you. So we have a Minister of Diversity, Inclusion and Youth appointed by our Prime Minister, which tells you that this is an absolutely key priority for the Prime Minister. And there is a minister at the cabinet table that is thinking and reviewing cabinet material constantly from the perspective of, is it promoting diversity and inclusion? Is it tackling racism and hate? That minister is also at the Treasury Board table. So she's one of 6 ministers at the Treasury Board. And every Treasury Board submission is also scrutinized from the perspective, is it improving inclusion? Is it improving diversity? So our Prime Minister is deeply committed to equality and inclusion and has done a lot to show that.
Thank you, Joyce. Next up, of course, is Peter. Peter.
Thank you very much. What it takes is a comprehensive strategy. What it takes is the federal government showing leadership. We have not seen that leadership over the course of the last few years, as we have seen growing hate. And just to cite the appalling statistics, in the Lower Mainland, the rise in anti-Asian hate has increased 300%. We know rising anti-Semitism, rising Islamophobia. We see the hate manifest right across the country in right-wing groups that are attempting to exploit what is a situation that people are finding themselves in great difficulty. And so this is why we need that comprehensive strategy. This is why we need an approach that takes leadership. And Jagmeet Singh is, having experienced himself racism and hate, has shown remarkable leadership. He's the one who can help us build a better country where racism and hate is only a memory.
Peter, many thanks. And finally, we will go on to Nick to wrap up this round. Nick, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, this is an issue that requires leadership. It requires leadership at the head of the federal service as we continue to do work to dismantle systems of oppression, discrimination, and racism inside of the federal public service. It requires leadership as we must continue to work to dismantle systems of racism, oppression, discrimination inside of police services across this country. And it requires those same efforts to be redoubled again as we consider immigration and refugee services in this country. It is so important that we take the time to acknowledge first that there are these issues, that they exist, and that we have work yet to be done. That work is not easy, but the point is that we must do it. That work involves us reviewing the policies that have allowed these systems of oppression to exist, be created in the first place, and then tackle head on these issues, because again, there is no time left for us to even be able to tolerate violence, oppression in any form, discrimination in any form, inside any arm or branch of services affected by the federal government. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank all candidates for that first round of questions. We're now going to move on to the second theme of today's event, which is seniors' care. The cost of living is going up across Canada, and seniors can be particularly vulnerable to these increases. What are your party's plans to reduce their financial stress and better protect vulnerable seniors in our community? And based on the lessons learned in the pandemic, how should the new government address quality of care for seniors in long-term care and assisted living homes? We will begin this round of questions with Joyce Murray. Joyce.
Thanks for that question. And of course, caring for seniors opportunities, seniors affordability are matters that we hold deeply at heart in the Liberal Party of Canada. And we have seen a wave of various supports for seniors from before the pandemic, but also during the pandemic. The lowest income seniors, in fact, 1 of 5 of those seniors have been lifted above the poverty line by Liberal programs to increase the GIS and increase the OAS. We have also supported seniors in long-term care with a several billion-dollar pot to help the provinces and territories to invest in the long-term care homes, because some of those homes were so dreadfully out of date, with people sharing rooms and all of the implications of that on their health during COVID, and the mortality rate that was so shocking that we all saw. So in addition to that, we have some major programs to increase the number of doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners, 7,500 more in Canada, to train 50,000 personal support workers, and to fund their salaries going up to $25 an hour. So there's a whole range of things that need to be done, and many of these we actually have done, or they're in our platform, because having seniors treated respectfully, to have a quality of life, and to be lifted above poverty lines is a very high priority for us.
Great. Thank you, Joyce. Next up in this round is Peter Julian. Peter, 2 minutes.
I'm going to start with the last question first, which is our long-term care facilities across the country. We have seen the examples of appalling conditions in long-term care homes, above all in the for-profit. These are multinational companies that are operating on a for-profit basis. Many of them have received hundreds of millions of dollars in government support, and they used much of that money for dividends and for executive bonuses. In some of these for-profit chains, we have seen hundreds of deaths of workers and residents at the same time as they have used money in such an inappropriate way. So the NDP position is very clear. We need to take profit out of the long-term care sector. and provide adequate funding so that every single senior can live with dignity in their long-term care. The NDP put forward that plan in the last Parliament, and Liberals and Conservatives voted against it. We disagree profoundly that we should be financing, the federal government should be financing for-profit chains. We believe that it's the quality of care for seniors that has to be first and foremost. And we know that most Canadians agree that profit needs to be taken out of the long-term care sector, and the federal government needs to step up with adequate financing so that the workers are protected as this pandemic continues, or if the next pandemic hits, and the residents are protected as well and given an effective and high level of care. We also believe that the home care sector needs to be provided for in our budget proposals. Our election platform shows a significant and historic level of support for home care so that seniors can stay in their home longer. It also makes sense in terms of unleashing some of the stress from the healthcare system. So our approach on long-term care and home care are fundamental to making sure seniors have the quality of life that they deserve.
All right, thanks for that, Peter. Nick, you've heard from a lot of different topics on these two broad questions, so there's a lot you can fit in. You have 2 minutes to address this at first.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, there are a few basic fundamental human rights at play here. One is the right to security in retirement. The other one is the right to comprehensive, universal, head-to-toe care from cradle to grave. I'm going to start with the first one there. We've seen that for many seniors, OAS, JS, and CPP is inadequate in maintaining a quality of life that keeps folks out of poverty. Right now, we see the number of seniors living in poverty rising, not shrinking, and that's going in the wrong direction. What we need to do is we need to protect pensions. We need to guarantee a livable income to everyone as a right, and to make sure that both the CPP is well funded and that federally regulated pensions are 100% protected in insolvency. No more should we have cases where Sears, for example, can go under and strip away the pensions of workers who've built massive amounts of equity in those funds, their lives, that are counting on that to retire. To healthcare, long-term care, vision, hearing, dental, mental health, and pharmacare should be rights for all, not privileges for a select wealthy few. In taking that profit out of long-term care homes, we can ensure that everyone gets a life with dignity, and ensuring that we invest in making sure that seniors can age in place and age in their homes, receive home care that's also funded through our system. We can not only lower costs for the government, but also, again, ensure that people are treated with respect. And in funding healthcare, truly comprehensive universal healthcare as a human right, we will not only improve the health outcomes of Canadians and treat people with the dignity that they deserve, but we will also reduce costs on the system. It is between guaranteeing that security in retirement as a right and guaranteeing healthcare as a human right for all that we will finally step out of the shadows and into the light of what seniors do truly deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And finishing off the first round of questions in this part of the event, we will go to Kenny Chiu. Kenny.
Well, thank you. It is important to understand that seniors are facing a very difficult situations right now in Canada, especially in the post-pandemic era that we're in, with the inflation skyrocketing. But what we need is more than just money can resolve. What we need is protection of our seniors. Conservative will help the many Canadians who are taking care of the parents, especially in many of the ethnic communities. Like, for example, myself, my mother is still living with me at the age of 84. To help seniors avoid having to live in long-term care homes by providing a little bit of support, by introducing the Canada Senior Care Benefit, paying $200 per month per household to any Canadians who is living with and taking care of a parent over the age of 70. We believe family will provide good care for aging parents. We're also, Conservative will also provide stronger protection of seniors by amending the criminal code provision in case they have to live in a senior home, that they will have to, the facility will provide the necessity of life to make clear that the operator of a licensed care facility, private or not, shall be presumed to have a legal duty to the residents of that facility. We will require more transparencies of investment management fees so that seniors and savers, they don't get ripped off. Conservative will also make available $3 million of the infrastructure funding over the next 3 years to renovate long-term facilities and care homes in all provinces and territories across Canada to improve the care and residents receive. We will encourage partnerships with private nonprofits that have historically been providing a significant amount of long-term care. Thank you.
Kenny, thanks for that. We now go into the second part of this question where everyone is given 1 minute for a follow-up. Again, the same order as the first part of this. So we will begin with Joyce. Joyce.
Well, thanks. And we see healthcare for seniors and all Canadians as a very high priority. And so I'd just like to paint a couple of contrasts here. One is with the Conservative platform. The Liberal platform has $60 billion over 5 years in various supports for healthcare for Canadians. The Conservative platform is back-ending their healthcare to somewhere after 6 to 10 years from now, and there is actually only $3.6 billion in the first 5 years, 3.6 billion compared with 60 billion. And I would say with mental health care, there's a big contrast with the NDP. We have committed $5 billion to support mental health care for all ages, including students. The NDP has no specific commitment at all to health students, no money for the provinces, no plan to expand access to free universal mental health services. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Joyce. Next up is Peter. Peter, there were some accusations towards your party there as well, so you have 1 minute to speak to that or anything else on this topic.
Well, that's too bad because first off, I want to say that given the many seniors in poverty and the growing poverty, that we have put forward the guaranteed livable basic income for seniors and people with disabilities. Also, as the healthcare party, we have, and Jagmeet Singh as national leader has spoken eloquently about this, healthcare from the top of our heads to the soles of our feet, which includes dental care, national Pharmacare that Ms. Murray voted against, and ensuring mental health services right across the country. It's a comprehensive plan. So the reality is the NDP is the only party presenting a comprehensive healthcare platform that includes addressing the cuts that we've seen both from Liberals and Conservatives to our healthcare sector. Final point, Liberals have discriminated against those seniors under 75 and over 75. We would provide supports and lift them all out of poverty.
All right, Peter, thank you for that. We now go on to Nick. Nick, you have 1 minute to respond to anything that you've heard.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter, for mentioning the cuts to healthcare, the 6% escalator that Stephen Harper cut and that Trudeau failed to reinstate is absolutely essential. But we also must back end that to make sure that we're actually at the level that we would have been had those cuts never taken place. It's critically important that we recognize that accessibility of healthcare is as big of an issue as whether that healthcare is universal. Yes, we need more doctors and nurses, but with 40% of nurses in British Columbia eligible to retire in the next 5 years, and nurses and physicians leaving the profession en masse now because both the quality and the conditions that they're working in have deteriorated and the wages remain poor, we must not only be investing in new hires and new trainees, but also in retaining the considerable wealth of knowledge and experience of the physicians and nurses that currently work in our system. It is so important that we look at the compensation of physicians and nurses and how best the federal government can assist the province in funding a system that we can be proud of as a world leader and not the second worst healthcare system among high-income countries, ahead of only the United States.
Right,
Which,
Nick,
by the way,
Nick, I'm going to cut you off. Nick, I'm going to cut you off there. We now go on to conclude this round of follow-ups. Kenny Chiu. Kenny, you have 1 minute.
Well, thank you. Wouldn't it be great if any hate can be legislated away and any senior problem can just throw money at it and be solved? The matter of fact is Canada, it's in a huge deficit right now. Every day we have spent $424 million more than we actually earn. And as a result, we have to be very careful and be very careful with the taxpayer money that we are collecting. And seniors would not appreciate us in buying their votes with the credit cards of their grandchildren and the future generations. Conservatives realize that this is not a responsible way by just throwing money at the problem. However, we also came up with, for example, as I reported earlier, there's a Canada Senior Care benefit encouraging families taking care of itself, cultural communities like Chinese, for example. This is actually very important. We also understand that we have an obligation to prevent our seniors from being ripped off by investment management fees and all these other predators. And so there are many ways to protect our seniors and build up their resilience instead of just like the Liberals and the NDP proposing throw money at the problem.
All right. Thank you, Kenny. That wraps up this portion of the town hall. We now go to our third question today, which is post-pandemic economic recovery. With housing prices skyrocketing, many people cannot afford to own a home or even raise a family. What will your party do to support affordability, and how will these measures address inequality in society? And what steps will your party take to support Canada's economic recovery in the next few years? For this part of the debate, we will begin with Peter Julian. Peter, you have 2 minutes.
Thanks so much. And this is a great question because it does link two issues that are very much together. I'll start off by saying that the NDP released the costed part of our program on the weekend. The Parliamentary Budgetary Officer, an independent officer of Parliament, evaluated all of the major party programs and actually found that the NDP program had the smallest deficit. It's the Conservatives and Liberals that are spending and refusing to get the revenue. So, Mr. Chiu, you really need to talk to your own party about its financial mismanagement. The reality is the NDP is building the recovery by ensuring that the ultra-rich pay their fair share, putting in place a wealth tax, making sure that there is a pandemic's profits tax. We've had billionaires reap $80 billion in additional wealth during this pandemic, and we've had many of the web giants reaping enormous profits without paying any taxes at all. So we need a fair tax system as a starting point. And then providing the supports for housing, for example, which is in a crisis right now in the Lower Mainland. We would build 500,000 affordable units of housing like we did after the Second World War. We made sure that we had housing available for everybody. We'll do the same thing again, working with municipalities, working with nonprofits, working with the cooperative sector. We also believe in public universal pharmacare. I know the Conservatives and Liberals don't, but this is a major advantage economically for small businesses, as well as providing supports for the 10 million Canadians who have no access to drug plans. And many of them are having to choose between taking medication or keeping a roof over their head. We'll make sure that there are more doors open to post-secondary education. And we have that comprehensive healthcare plan that helps everybody, including small businesses, because it takes a lot of the burden off of their receipts. And so that's the NDP's comprehensive approach to an economic recovery.
All right. Thank you for that, Peter. We now move on to Nick Loughton. Nick.
Thanks, Justin. First, let's acknowledge that we're definitely not post-pandemic yet. We're still in the thick of things with, for example, ICUs filling up in Alberta to record levels. By no means are we even close to being post-pandemic right now. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed some very deep inequalities in society, but that were absolutely present there beforehand. I don't have the stats for the Lower Mainland offhand, but a one-bed apartment to rent in Victoria is now $1,700 a month. And that's just so unaffordable for the people who live here that folks in my generation are being priced out of not just owning a home, but ever renting in the city in their own place as well without having roommates. No, what we need now is to guarantee a decent job with a living wage, a quality education, security in unemployment, disability, sickness, and retirement, a clean environment, comprehensive, truly universal healthcare as rights and not privileges for folks here. Yes, part of that economic recovery means investing in infrastructure, investing in building new affordable housing, but it also means looking at the way that workers have been robbed of their productivity, of wages to keep up with the cost of living, of wages to even keep up with inflation over the last several decades. It is critically important that we consider the impacts that low wages have had on creating this kind of economic crisis that we are facing now in this country today. So what the federal government can do is implement that guaranteed livable basic income, to implement a living wage for every single federally regulated employee, and to make sure that we again line up those wages with that cost of the productivity that's been costed and taken away from those workers, and to build adequate, safe, secure, affordable housing guaranteed to all as a right. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We now go on to Kenny Chiu. Kenny, 2 minutes.
Post-pandemic economic recovery, I think Nick is right. We're still in the thick of it, but at least we have achieved, this country has achieved significantly that we could start dreaming and start planning how to recover from that. And only conservatives are so focused on economic recovery. As I said, that this country this year has added $154 billion to our national debt. It's already exceeding 1.2 trillion. Well, we are paying tens of billions of dollars just in servicing the debt right now. If interest rate goes up, that will mean tens of billions of dollars not going into much needed service. And this is why conservatives have come up with plans, very detailed plans, and we name our platform Canada's Recovery Plan. And this is a comprehensive plan that details a recovery that will enlarge the pie, as you will, that will boost employment, industry growth, and makes lives better for all Canadians, as it does so in a way that is fiscally responsible, so we don't pass on unsustainable debt to the future generations or tax the current generations from being able to advance in life. Our detailed plan to get Canada's back on track and back to work includes with 4 major initiatives to create jobs. The first one is Canada Job Search Plan. We're paying up to 50% of the salary of new hires for 6 months following the end of CEWS, the wage subsidy. Secondly, Canada Investment Accelerator, getting companies to spending money and creating jobs by providing 5% investment tax credit for any capital investment made in 2022. Thirdly, we rebuild Main Street tax credit, providing 25% tax credit on amounts of up to $100,000 that Canadian personally invest in small business. And lastly, Main Street Business Loan. We're providing loans up to $200,000 to help small and medium businesses in hospitality, retail, and tourism to get back on their feet, with up to 25% being forgivable. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kenny. Finishing off the first part of this section is Joyce Murray. Sure, Joyce, you have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you. What an important question. I do agree with Nick that we're not through the pandemic yet. And so job number 1 is to help Canada get through this COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, we've done a very fulsome job of supporting Canadians and businesses and organizations and nonprofits over the last 18 months. And that's one of the reasons that we've seen some 94% of the jobs that were lost already come back. And it's probably ties into why we have a AAA credit rating that has been confirmed by the bond rating agency. So how do we get through this pandemic? Vaccination. So that's why we are supporting mandatory vaccinations by the provinces and the federal government's public servants, as well as federal travel. Unfortunately, the Conservatives don't support that. So once we're through, how are we going to recover and have an affordable life? Well, firstly, we started right out in 2016 by raising the taxes on the wealthiest 1% and reducing them on the middle class to make life more affordable. Now we're offering $10 a day universal daycare, which will save families on average about over $900 a month. So that's a very important economic recovery program, as well as it will allow women who may be staying at home to look after the kids, because daycare, you can't get it. And if you can, it's very costly. Thirdly, we are committed to universal Pharmacare, Peter, and we've already signed a deal with one of the provinces. We can't go it alone, of course. And we've also already put $500 million into that. And lastly, housing. We have a very strong housing plan, but we also have a great track record. We'll create 1.4 million more units of supply, as well as a homeowner's bill of rights that will reduce the speculation that's been happening in our housing market.
All right, thank you for that, Joyce. We now will once again start at the beginning for this round, allowing each of the candidates to have 60 seconds to say anything in response to what they've heard so far or that they didn't get in their initial answer. We begin with Peter Julian. Peter.
Thanks very much. So a guaranteed livable basic income for seniors and for people with disabilities, making sure that we have a right to housing in this country and a comprehensive housing program like we had after the Second World War, ensuring that we have healthcare from the tip of the head right to the soles of our feet, including Pharmacare. These are all fundamental issues. And I think that's why more and more Canadians are warming to the NDP. They see the NDP as credible on these issues. The Liberals said no to Pharmacare. They voted against the Canada Pharmacare Act. And this agreement that they have with Prince Edward Island is 0.1% of what would be required to actually bring Pharmacare into place in Prince Edward Island. It's an $8 million small funding for some types of drugs. It is not Pharmacare, and Liberals should start talking about that as well. They've slashed CERB, the Liberals have, and they've made things much more difficult for people because the pandemic is not over. We need to provide supports now.
Peter, thank you for that. We now go to Nick. Nick, 60 seconds.
Yeah, as a former nano-vaccine researcher, I'm really actually quite dismayed to see the politicization of vaccines occurring in this debate right now. So I'm just going to ask everyone on this call to please refrain from politicizing this issue. The public health experts are clear. We need to get vaccinated. The public health experts are clear. Let's keep this in the hands of the public health experts and keep it out of the hands of politicians. Liberals have a housing plan, which is wonderful, but I can't sleep under a plan. I need a roof over my head. And quite frankly, the homes aren't getting built. Now, Kenny's concerned about the debt. And yeah, we've racked up some bad debt in recent years, but investing in the critical infrastructure that is going to take to get us out of this pandemic, investing in the jobs that we're going to create for workers of the future is the kind of good debt that we need to be able to take on in this country. Just like no one has the cash up front to buy a house, they're going to take out a mortgage. So let's do that by raising taxes on the wealthiest corporations, multinational corporations, ending tax havens, and doing that because that's going to raise far more revenue than a wealth tax. Thanks.
Nick, thanks for that. Kenny, you are next. 60 seconds.
I'm going to spend some time to talk about the conservative housing strategy, how to do with affordability, because Richmond is in the epicenter of that huge problem that we're facing. Our next generation finds they are being priced out of possibility of owning their own place. So conservatives realize that there is a supply and demand imbalance here in the city and also Lower Mainland and the GTA area. We realize that in order to resolve the problem, we have to, first of all, to address the over competition in the demand side. So by for example, putting an embargo on foreign investors in the residential market and welcoming them in the rental market, on one hand, we're going to reduce the competition, and the other side, we're going to be increasing the rental market. And as also the federal government is going to release up to 15% of our surplus land so that we can provide more housing. And thirdly, Nick is right, we have the capital capital. We are going to smartly invest in infrastructure.
And unfortunately, you don't have time to make that third point there. Next time. We will now finish this round of 60-second follow-ups with Joyce Murray. Joyce.
Well, thank you. I'm going to take the opportunity to speak a little bit more about housing because that is such a big concern right now. And the federal government the Liberal government have done so much on this already, and we're planning to do so much more. So we've had a national housing strategy, getting the federal government back into housing for the first time in decades. And we put in place $72 billion to build up supply. We've already invested almost $6 billion has been transferred over to British Columbia, and it's thousands of units of affordable housing for people who rent-controlled housing and housing for those that are at risk of homelessness. And now we have many measures to make housing more affordable for the middle class. We've already delivered homes for 2 million people across Canada, actually, and we'll be investing to build 1.4 million units more. That's
Joyce, it's unfortunately we more than a minute there, unfortunately. That wraps up this round of questioning. We now go to our fourth theme of today's event, which is immigrants and refugees. Questions are, how do you plan to advocate for immigrants and refugees as a member of parliament? Do you think that Canada's immigration and refugee levels post-pandemic are adequate, or should we attract more newcomers to support Canadian population needs? And the current plan is a target of 400,000 new immigrants a year. And secondly, with the increasing need for immigrants to complement our population growth in Canada, what is the government's plan to provide adequate funding to support newcomers in settlement and resettlement in our country? We will begin this round with Nick. Nick, 2 minutes.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah. So as the son of an immigrant, as a first generation Canadian myself, I'm obviously an advocate for immigration in this country. When we welcome the best and brightest around the world to Canada, we continue to build a vibrant, diverse, and welcoming society here. Canada's immigration and refugee levels post-pandemic should absolutely be increased to mirror or an increase relative to the pre-pandemic levels. When we bring in the best and brightest from around the world, we can create that 21st century economy of the future, where we can invest in green technology, invest in meeting our climate goals, and invest in meeting the needs of folks who live here and folks who live abroad. What we need to do to attract newcomers here and amongst the best and brightest is to invest in quality education, healthcare, and housing here, because that's what will give us the competitive advantage over other countries. We look at the countries who have done well on this file in Europe, for example, or we look at the competitive advantages of a place like the States. You have better wages or you have better services. When we have neither here, we're not able to compete. What we need to do is we need to have the best education system in the world, not just better than the States, the best healthcare system in the world, not just better than the States. And we need to be pushing to ask, why can't we do better on these files? Why are we willing to accept second last on these files? Because at the end of the day, if I was looking at Canada and Canada was second last to the Netherlands, to Australia, I might be very tempted to go and move there instead. So what we need to do is we need to invest comprehensively in having that housing available for folks who want to move to Canada to be able to live here, to invest in their future, to be able to find that home, that Canadian dream right here in Victoria and in Vancouver. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Nick. We move on next to Kenny Chiu. Kenny, 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Justin. Canada's Conservatives are the party that ended racial discriminations in Canadian immigration. We're the party that streamlined processes of refugees and persecuted minorities. We established the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Project, and we're the party that ensure that those who arrive on our shores have the greatest chance to succeed. We will welcome the best and brightest from around the world to fill critical gaps and robust growth of our economy. At the same time, we're going to streamline Canadians' family. We are going to strengthen Canadian families through compassionate reunifications with their loved ones. We're going to offer refugees to heroic human rights defenders and those fleeing persecutions who would enrich our national life. Sadly, the Auditor General has revealed that although with much aspirations and virtual signaling, Canada's immigration system, it's backed up and suffers a lack of transparency, accountability, and communication. Conservatives seek to address these administrative shortfalls by streamlining the process and taking steps to enhance fairness in immigration processing. We will scrap the family unification lottery and place priority on those coming for childcare and child support. We are going to strengthen foreign credential recognition by creating a credential recognition task force. We're going to use technology to improve application processing. In other words, Canada's Conservatives, we are going to make immigrants easier, their arrival better, easier, smoother, and then their life here in Canada better. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. We move on next to Joyce Murray. Joyce, 2 minutes for you as well.
Well, thank you. And we consider immigration a huge part of what Canada is and the diverse country that we have. And we are incredibly supportive of bringing more immigration to Canada. So we're upping the numbers to 400,000, as was already mentioned. Some of the ways that we support newcomers is through things I've already mentioned. The child tax benefit, the Canada Child Benefit, which has lifted over 400,000 children above the poverty line, is available to new Canadians. So what we also are going to do to bring more immigrants into Canada is to target people who are already working or studying here. So we've got a fast track pathway for people who have been working to support us, to support our seniors during this pandemic crisis. And people who are studying here or working here, the university students, will have a fast track to permanent residency. I do want to say that the Conservative Party, and when they were in government, they actually cut the family reunification program, which made it very difficult for people to bring their family members, their parents, to come and help them with childcare, to come and be have an extended family. And we've increased the family reunification program. Mr. Harper and his ministers actually called refugees from the Tamil community when they came by boats here, queue jumpers, and really, I thought, tried to turn the country against them, which was very sad to see. They also cut healthcare for refugees. And that the court called it cruel and unusual treatment and overturned it. But the Conservatives then appealed.
Joyce, unfortunately, we're out of time on that one. I imagine Kenny will have something to say in the follow-ups as well. But first on this, we go to end our order to Peter Julian. Peter, 2 minutes for you.
Thank you very much. First, a quick clarification around the housing figures that Ms. Murray cited. I did an order paper question that the bureaucrats from the federal government themselves responded to. In the entire first term of 4 years, when we needed 200,000 new units of housing just to stem the existing level of homelessness, the federal government financed 14,000 only, so 7% of what was needed. Now, the immigration issue is fundamental. I represent the area that's the most diverse in Canada, 150 different languages spoken in New Westminster, Burnaby. When Mr. Trudeau called this election, it was the night that Kabul fell. The next day, there were lineups around the block outside my constituency office from Canadians of Afghan origin inquiring about their families. And when we tried to contact the Ministry of Immigration, we were told that key officials were on leave. You can surmise from that if they're on leave, they're probably working a Liberal election campaign. This is symbolic of what chaos has come to the immigration ministry over the course of both the Conservative and Liberal governments. They are simply not investing in the resources that are needed to make sure that there is no backlog, that there's no lineups, that people are treated fairly. It's simply been a deterioration that we've seen over the last 15 to 20 years. What the NDP would do is clean up the backlog. We'd make the investments that are so important. We would also make sure that things that are fundamental, like language training, is available to new Canadians so that they get the opportunity to succeed. And above all, actually put in place a credential recognition system. The joke in New Westminster Burnaby, it's kind of a sad joke, is if you need to get medical care, call a taxi, because that's probably a physician who's trained in another country who is driving the taxi because his credentials aren't recognized. That needs to end. Those doctors, nurses need to be in a system and they need to be working.
Peter, thank you for that. We now go to the second part of this part of the discussion, which is the 1 minute follow-up for all candidates. And we begin, of course, with Nick Loughton. Nick, 60 seconds.
Yeah, family reunification is so important. Including, removing visa requirements for parents to come and visit their kids, or allowing, increasing funding in our system to allow parents and grandparents to be reunified with their families here. As far as a pathway to citizenship goes, though, we have so many barriers in place. For some refugees, even $1,000 to apply for permanent residency is just simply too much. We've got to be able to make exemptions for people who are otherwise going to be denied access to what we consider basic services here in this country. What we're missing right now, yes, Peter, we're missing that skills accreditation, that recognition. It would absolutely be so sad to know that we have so many skilled workers in this country who are unable to meet the accreditation in Canada because we're simply not interested in making that process streamlined and make that work for people. So what we need to do is we need to invest in people who, yes, the Liberals and Conservatives might not see as voters, but they are important folks to the backbone of our economy. Thank you.
Nick, thank you. Kenny, we now go to you. I imagine you have some stuff to say after Joyce's comments last time around.
Well, thank you, Justin. Instead of rebuttal, I will just highlight the fact that matters that Conservative has a long and proud history of assisting those who are in need across the globe. We will continue our legacy of humanitarian refugee settlement by increasing and promoting private refugee sponsorship, because overwhelming evidence now proves that privately sponsored refugees are more likely to succeed than publicly sponsored ones, even after they have been in Canada for a long time. Our Canada Conservatives will also make the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Project a permanent government program. We'll work with the LGBTQ plus organizations in Canada to encourage and facilitate greater participation of these organizations in refugee sponsorship. We'll also waive records of arrest, charge, or conviction related to pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong when processing visa, and provide documentations for those fleeing Hong Kong and seeking asylum in Canada.
Kenny, thank you for that. We now turn to Joyce Murray. Sure, Joyce, you have 60 seconds.
Well, thank you. I'll just add a couple of things that we're doing now, given this worldwide situation. One is creating a new stream for human rights defenders. Secondly, creating safe haven for those facing persecution, and really we're world leading in resettlement to those fleeing political or security crises. And that's one of the reasons that we've agreed to accept and settle 40,000 people from Afghanistan. I'll use my remaining moments to thank Success and CIJA for all of your work on helping immigrants and refugees with all of the complicated matters that a new Canadian faces when they come to a new country. So I think very important work that you both do.
Thank you for that, Joyce. And finishing off this round of questions and follow-ups is Peter Julian. Peter, 1 minute.
Thank you. Well, I would echo Ms. Murray's comments about success in CIJA, and would like to address the issue of the chaos in the immigration system. We've got good organizations that are working hard. We've got nonprofits, but we cannot, when we do not have a functional management of the Ministry of Immigration, we cannot make headway for either new Canadians or people who want to come to Canada or their families. We currently have a lottery that lasts about 8 minutes at the beginning of the year. There's a period where you can apply for sponsorship. I have heard so many complaints from new Canadians about that 8-minute window, 8 minute in the course of the entire year where you can apply for sponsorship. And of course, it tends to be companies that are well prepared and have data systems that can make that application. We need to make our immigration system far more responsive and humane. That will come with an NDP government.
Peter, thank you for that. And thank you all for answering those questions in that round. We move now to the 5th of 6 discussions today. The topic here is healthy and safe communities. Without a healthy and safe environment, families cannot thrive and children cannot realize their potential. Crime, homelessness, and mental health issues are affecting an ever-growing number of Canadians. How will your party holistically attempt to resolve these challenges? And second, those affected by the housing crisis are often women with children or folks who often face other forms of discrimination, including Indigenous people, immigrants and refugees, those living with a disability, and seniors. We talked about housing affordability earlier, but what will you specifically do to include marginalized populations, such as women and families can find the homes that they need? And we begin this round with Kenny Chiu. Kenny, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. We believe, Conservative believe Canada, it's a community. We believe we must nurture, mobilize, and encourage generosity, individual talent, patriotism, and the sense of community. While we have a very comprehensive platform that deals with a wide variety of community health and safety concerns, I would like to focus on something that we don't often have to hear talked about. Firstly, COVID-19 has accelerated gender-based violences in our country. StatsCan reported that the cases of domestic violence increased by over 54% between mid-March and early July just last year. These statistics are even more worse for marginalized women. For far too long, we have let people who committed domestic violence off with a slap on the wrist. This does a massive disservice to their innocent victims who are left with to suffer. It also puts the broader community at risk. We have seen repeatedly that the criminals who committed attacks of violence almost always start by abusing their spouse or partners. Canada Conservatives, we believe that we should impose tough sentences on those who assault their spouse or partners while making it easier for victims to escape their abusers and rebuild their lives. Canada's Conservatives will get tough on abuser by strengthening the criminal code to ensure that they are punished and prevented from continuing to hurt their victims. We will also help those who have suffered to rebuild their lives. We will help them get career training and hide the new location from their abusers. And we will boost Canada child benefit funding, going to the mothers fleeing violence to help them obtain permanent housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. We now move to Joyce Murray. Joyce, you have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you. And when I think of healthy and safe communities, I also think about what we're doing to tackle climate change, because the climate change affects marginalized people more than others. And we've got a climate strategy that has been identified by academics, neutral experts, as being the best amongst all the parties, and strong and effective, as well as cost effective compared with any of the other parties. To me, that is an important thing for all Canadians to know, that we are tackling climate change. So daycare, having universal low-cost daycare is very important to healthy communities. We're also committed to a strong feminist recovery and have, well, daycare fits into that, of course, but we also have funding for women's entrepreneurship and a range of different programs to support women and women of color and other marginalized groups. We've invested $600 million into the opioid crisis, which is an absolutely heart-wrenching situation for so many families. But we're improving access to treatment, and we see this as a health issue, not a criminal issue. But the last thing I want to say is that we put forward a bill to change the kind of discrimination happening against Indigenous people in the justice and the prison, the corrections system, as well as the Black population, so that they will be supported to be able to leave prison and be productive and successful in society.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Next up, of course, is Peter Julian. Peter, you have 2 minutes to address this very complex topic.
Thank you. Well, I would agree that contending with the climate crisis is fundamental to ensuring healthy and safe communities. I would disagree that the massive expenditure, up to $20 billion for the Trans Mountain Pipeline, is the way to achieve it. The infrastructure around Trans Mountain will increase our greenhouse gas emissions by up to 50%. It's a 50-year project. And given the heat dome, given the massive deaths we saw across British Columbia this summer, it is irresponsible of Mr. Trudeau to try to ram through that pipeline. We also believe in housing, and this is a part of our approach on the 500,000 units of affordable housing that we would build, Indigenous-led, working with marginalized groups, working with the nonprofit sector and cooperative housing. These are all ways that we ensure the right to housing for every Canadian, which we've presented in the House of Commons and which have been twice rejected by Conservatives and Liberals. We also will put forward the guaranteed livable basic income for seniors, lifting them out of poverty, and people with disabilities. And I can tell you, as a volunteer, my wife and I grow food for both the Burnaby Food Bank and the New Westminster Food Bank, that so many of the people who come to those food banks because they are food insecure are people with disabilities. This question also tackles the opioid crisis, and I want to take the last few moments to talk about that. This needs to be declared a public health emergency. We need to decriminalize possession and ensure safe supply, and above all, we need to investigate Big Pharma's role in what has been a catastrophic loss of thousands and thousands of lives. Big Pharma needs to be investigated. And if it is true that there are links between Big Pharma and the opioid crisis, Big Pharma needs to pay for the victims, the compensation to the victims' families. This is how we bring an end, and other countries have already succeeded in bringing an end to the opioid crisis.
Thank you for that, Peter. And finishing off the first part with 2-minute responses to this, we go to Nick Loughton. Nick.
Well, this election must be about climate change. If both the Liberals and the NDP found a way to shoehorn it into a question really about safe and affordable housing and healthy and safe communities with marginalized folks. We'll touch on that in a sec. Homelessness is best addressed by a housing first approach. Let's not reinvent the wheel here, though. I mean, let's take a page out of the books of other countries around the world like Finland, who have shown us that housing first not only is the cost-effective solution, but it is also the compassionate answer. When we take the compassionate approach on things like addiction, mental health, we're able to provide safe supply, decriminalize drugs, and move towards a society that treats everyone with the love and compassion that they deserve. You know, whether your lesson is to do unto others, or to love thy neighbor, or to measure the value of our society by how we treat those who are most marginalized, every single conclusion we reach says that in order to address crime, we must address rehabilitation and recidivism over punishment. We must address addiction by making it a health issue, not a criminal issue. And we must address mental health by providing accessible, universal coverage for that key issue. As far as housing goes, what we need desperately in this community, especially in Victoria, is in fact recognizing that, yes, this disproportionately affects marginalized folks, Indigenous folks in this community, and we need trauma-informed and Indigenous-backed groups to be able to address the fact that intergenerational trauma and poverty have played such a massive role in creating this crisis, and that if we fail to recognize the way that the social injustices, the racial injustices have played into this economic crisis, we will not be able to address it fully. So the key issue here then is to make sure that as we bring this issue to the forefront, we are not only using the economic informed practices, but also the social and racial angles, the trauma informed practices that we know are the best ways to both reach people where they're at and also extend an olive branch in a hand to bring people back to society. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We now have 1 minute each for each of the candidates for a follow-up, and we begin with Kenny.
The reality is that women in Canada experience barriers of equal opportunities throughout their lives. Canadian girls, as they approach adolescence, experience higher level of abuse and violence and greater declines in mental health and confidence than boys do. This can be partially attributed to the specific challenges they face related to harmful gender stereotypes and sexualization. Similarly, senior women in Canada experience higher level of abuse, violence, and poverty than men. Other forms of discrimination and marginalization can exacerbate these challenges. Conservatives' comprehensive plan includes additional measures to help empower women, such as ensuring women to have the training they need to pursue careers, including non-traditional careers like the skilled trades, and helping women start and build their own businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. Next, as a 60-second long follow-up to this is Joyce. Joyce, go ahead.
Well, thank you. I'm going to make a few points here quickly. One is in May a year ago, the Liberals banned the use, sale, or import of assault-style weapons used in most mass shootings. And the Conservatives on page 90 of their platform promised to bring them back. So that does not make things safer for women, that's for sure. Secondly, we have committed to end homelessness through our national housing strategy, but negotiating with the provinces and building new units doesn't happen overnight, but we are committed to doing that and have transferred, as I said, $6 billion to British Columbia already in our first term and before this election. And thirdly, climate. So important. And unfortunately, the Conservatives will take us back to the Harper era and the Harper targets. We cannot afford that. We have got to keep moving forward on climate.
Thank you, Joyce. And next up on this is Peter Julian. Peter, you have 60 seconds.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the sincerity of Ms. Murray, but the reality is Liberals have had 6 years. 6 years to bring an end to homelessness. Instead, it has increased. 6 years to bring an end to boiled water advisories. So Indigenous communities actually had safe drinking water. Instead, there are dozens that still have poisonous water. 6 years to bring in a new electoral system. And we know that that promise was jettisoned, as well as the promise on Pharmacare. So I simply do not believe, and I think many Canadians feel the same way, simply not believe Liberal promises anymore. The reality is, when we talk about all of these issues, they are interlinked, and we see increasing inequality in the country. And yet the Liberals, at the beginning of the pandemic, gave an unprecedented $750 billion in liquidity supports to Canada's big banks to maintain bank profits. All of these issues can be resolved with investments and leadership, and we're not seeing that from the current government.
Thank you for that, Peter. And wrapping up this portion of today's questions is Nick. Nick, 60 seconds to you as well.
Yeah, 6 years ago, we did elect a Liberal government, and they made a lot of promises and they broke a lot of promises. On the climate, we haven't hit a single target since 1992. We've got the worst emissions record in the G7. Our emissions continue to go up while the Americans level off, the Brits and the Germans decline, and we continue to lag behind the rest of the world. when we have a prime minister who promises to be a climate leader. Actions speak louder than words. What we need to do is we need to end fossil fuel subsidies now, not just at the federal level, where the Liberals have continued to subsidize fossil fuels to the tune of billions of dollars a year, costing British Columbians an average of $660 a year, but also at the provincial level, with Conservative governments in Alberta and NDP governments in BC subsidizing fossil fuels to the tune of, again, $330 a year here in BC. That's about $1,000 a year that we're paying to subsidize a 20th century dying industry. What we need to do is we need to dramatically cut emissions to under 60% of 2005 levels by 2030 and be net zero by 2040, because the Liberal climate plan, based on what the IPCC says, amounts to surrender. We need to be acting much more proactively than that. What we need to do is we need to look at the records of these parties.
I'm sorry, Nick, but that's being a minute. I appreciate everyone discussing climate, as it's obviously a very important topic today. We now go on to our sixth and final theme of the evening, however, which is the sustainability of charitable and nonprofit organizations. Nonprofits and charities help those most in need in our community. The financial stability of these organizations has suffered due to the pandemic that has jeopardized their ability to deliver the essential services they offer to communities. What will your party do to support the financial stability of charitable and nonprofit organizations as Canada continues to move towards a post-pandemic reality? And the Charities Directorate at the Canada Revenue Agency enforces the rules charities must follow in order to retain their status, and it doesn't have a policy role allowing it to proactively develop and promote the economic health of the sector. Do you think that the charity and nonprofit sector should have a dedicated entity within the government looking out for their interests? And if so, how do you think that should look? We begin this round of questioning with Joyce Murray. Joyce, you have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you for the question, because the sustainability of charitable and nonprofit organizations is so important to the fabric of our society, and especially for support for the most vulnerable. We know that COVID-19 had a disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations, and that's why at the start of the pandemic that we provided $350 million to support vulnerable Canadians through charities and nonprofit organizations that deliver these essential services, including food banks and women's shelters and many, many more. So what would we do to increase our support? Well, one thing is to expand eligibility for interest-free, partly forgivable loans that was available for businesses to see them through the pandemic, increase that to include nonprofit and charitable social enterprises. We want to contribute to the growth of organizations that are working on important measures like poverty reduction, saving people's lives in the opioid crisis, systemic racism, accessibility, Indigenous peoples, LGBTQ+, newcomers, racialized Canadians, and supporting seniors. So we'll continue to do that through the kinds of measures that we've been talking about throughout this evening, actually. This is equality, opportunity for all, reducing poverty, supporting the vulnerable. Those are key tenets of our Liberal values, and we'll continue to move forward on them.
Thank you for that. Joyce, I will have to note as well, in the interest of not going too far over time, we won't be doing the follow-up 2-minute remark or 1-minute remark on this one, so that you have 2 minutes total here. Peter, we go next to you.
Thank you very much. And this is a very key question in terms of how we move forward after COVID. We know that the charities, not only in Canada, but around the world, have been hard hit by COVID. Donations have shrunk, and that's not because people are not supportive of the charitable sector. It's because so many people are struggling to make ends meet, keep a roof over their head, to keep food on the table. And so that's had an impact all the way down the line. And many of the charities, up to 50% of them, are in financial difficulty across the country. So we need to make sure that we do not cut arbitrarily COVID supports, as the government has proposed and and rammed through just prior to the summer break with the budget. We need to make sure that that supports are available to the charitable and nonprofit sectors throughout this pandemic, and even with the Delta variant and potentially other variants that will continue and prolong this crisis in the coming months. Now, we also need to have a real role for charitable and nonprofit organizations. That's why the NDP's housing plan for 500,000 affordable housing units over the next few years is based on working with the charitable and nonprofit sector, providing the financing, but working with those organizations that are working with marginalized populations so that we can first and foremost target that right to housing for those that have been most disadvantaged by the incredible growth in inequality and the growth in homelessness in our country. So our commitment is that the charity and nonprofit sector would have a high presence, that there would be a partnership with the federal government, and the federal government would be working to address many of the issues that we're facing, working directly with the charitable and nonprofit sector.
All right, thank you, Peter. Nick, 2 minutes for you.
Thanks, Justin. And before I begin, I just want to say massive thank you to both CIJA and SUCCESS for putting this on. I take it this is going to be my last chance to speak, so massive shout out to all of you for putting on what I think is a fantastic event, and I hope very informative for everyone watching. It's so crazy to me that we would have the idea of charities and nonprofits filling the roles of essential services in our communities. I mean, that's just a massive failure on our part to make sure that those services are being provided writ large in general. I mean, whether it's shelters or whether it's charities that provide much needed supports to people, if there's a charity that's at risk of going under and therefore leaving an entire community underserved, that falls on us. That doesn't fall on the charitable organizations. That doesn't fall on the community. That falls at our feet. And so what we need to do is we need to take a long, hard look at how we've let charitable contributions made by the backs of Canadian taxpayers fund much needed services that otherwise the government simply either doesn't have an interest or doesn't have the resources to fund. Yes, we absolutely need to protect charities who are facing financial difficulties in the post-pandemic recovery. And yes, continuing to fund both Canadians and these organizations to allow them to continue to stay afloat is essential. But what we really need to do is take a long, hard look in the mirror as to how we've let this kind of situation fester this long for so long that we're now left in a position where there are people who really do risk facing inaccessibility to their basic services because the charitable organization that supports them may not be able to make it to the end of the year. If big businesses can have lobbyists and can have massive influence in our government, it's time that we let the nonprofit sector, who actually serves underfunded and marginalized people in our communities, also have access to have the ears of politicians and the ears of the federal service to be able to assist Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Nick. And finally, we go to Kenny Chiu. Kenny.
Thank you. Canadian charities and nonprofits employed over 2 million Canadians, and they do essential work supporting Canadian families. Never has their vital work been more evident than over the last year, as so many Canadians have lost their jobs and needed assistance. I first learned of Canadians' generosity when I started living in Canadian prairies in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And that's where I learned that the view expressed by Nick, for example, it's fundamentally flawed, because nothing is more beautiful of people helping people instead of relying on government. Embarrassingly, Canada's World Giving Index ranking dropped from being 4th to 14th just within 4 years. That was in 2019. Under the Liberal governments, I may add, this shows that not only during, but after the pandemic, charities will continue to face difficult challenges as they have been. We support to create a pilot programs to provide $150 million over 3 years in grants to nonprofits and charitable organizations delivering mental health and wellness programming. We support To boost charitable donations, Canadians Conservative will also increase the disbursement quota for charitable foundations to 7.5% to unlock the billions of dollars built up tax-free in foundations and put this money back to work to help Canadians. It is only through the community of Canada that we can solve the problem together and support and strengthen and empower our charitable organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. We just have a couple minutes remaining, but I'm going to give each of the candidates in order 45 seconds to answer the following questions from our accredited news media organizations, one from Omni TV and one from the Jewish Independent. Omni TV asks, how will your party address issues of systemic racism and hate crimes in our communities? And the Jewish Independent asks, small and medium-sized media platforms are a vital lifeline for information for ethnocultural communities in Canada. Would your party commit to additional supports for them experiencing economic challenges from the pandemic and from structural changes in the industry? We'll begin with Peter. Peter, you have 45 seconds.
Thank you very much. And thanks to CIJA, thanks to Success, and thanks to the media, Jewish Independent and Omni Television for being here today. I already responded to the issue of systemic racism and hate crimes. We have comprehensive legislation that would respond in a very robust way to what is growing racism. And that includes banning symbols of hate like the Nazi flag. And that involves an effective national strategy to push back against racism and hate that we are seeing growing in our communities. As far as media platforms are concerned, currently the web giants are not getting, even having to pay taxes. And what we would commit to is providing supports for local journalism, because it makes such a difference for the quality of journalism that we have in our country and in our communities.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. We now go to Nick. Nick, you do have another opportunity to wrap up.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, absolutely. This first question here, we've got 94 calls to action from the TRC that must be implemented. We've got calls to justice from the final report, Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. And we've got recommendations from the UN Working Group of People of African Descent for reducing racism, systemic racism in our country. We also must recognize that deplatforming hate speech on the internet is one of the most effective things that we can do to reduce hate crimes in our community. Right now, we're facing a really interesting challenge as advertising is taking over the media industry, and subscribership to a lot of media has fallen dramatically. Both implementing a guaranteed livable income with a basic income would give Canadians the ability to fund the media that they want to receive news from, and also ensuring that the Canadian government is on the side of creating many independent voices in media. It's critical for the future of the industry.
As much as I'd love everyone to talk more about how to help the media, we are on a tight deadline here, and I'll let Kenny have 45 seconds next.
Well, thank you. I think much has been said about how we can effectively address the systemic racism and hate crimes in Canada. But I just want to repeat that we're going to double the funding for a security infrastructure program. We are going to effectively draw the line between free speech and hate speech, and we are going to make those who express hate and promote violence for hate pay, and make sure that in online or in the real world that nothing like that will be permitted. On the other hand, though, we are understanding that the media is actually undergoing transformation. So we encourage more Canadians to have access to internet so that we can actually have more minorities or other media outlets that we can be supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. And we will wrap up this rapid fire final round with Joyce. Joyce, you have 45 seconds.
Okay, well, thank you. And I think I've already talked about how we address issues of systemic racism and hate crimes in the communities through legislation, through having a minister taking a look at that, through initiatives to strengthen communities and community organizations and faith-based organizations. We also have taken action to support the small and medium-sized media platforms, which are a vital lifeline for information to communities. I think what I want to close by saying that this is a very critical point in our country's history. We have an opportunity to move forward on some very vital things, or a conservative government, if they win this election, will take us backwards on climate, on childcare, on vaccinations, on gun control, on housing, and on healthcare. We can't afford that in Canada, and I hope the audience members will think about that. Thank you.
And Joyce, thank you for that. I want to thank all of the candidates for coming out today. I will now pass it over for closing remarks from CIJA and SUCCESS to Jeffrey Drucker, the chair of CIJA's Local Partner Council.
Thank you, Justin. My name is Jeffrey Drucker. As you said, I'm the chair of the Local Partner Council in the Pacific region for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CIJA. This has been another great opportunity for CIJA and SUCCESS to work in bringing our communities together, to hear from candidates seeking office, so we can be better informed about their views on issues that are important to our communities. We would like to thank the candidates for engaging us, for answering the questions which were submitted in advance by members of our communities. More importantly, you've done an excellent job of demonstrating the differences, and that is important. But you have also identified what you share. By putting aside your time, your careers, your social and family lives, and by dedicating yourselves to public service, you clearly demonstrate one vital common theme: a desire to make Canada a better place for all. Thank you, Joyce Murray, Kenny Chiu, Peter Julian, and Nick Loughton for your time and for your dedication. An event like this requires much thought, planning, and hard work. There are many staff and volunteers of SUCCESS and CIJA who have labored for weeks to put this afternoon together. Particular thanks to Kenny Chiu, Ryan Drew, Eddie Goldman, and Nico Slavinsky. Thank you, your colleagues, and the many volunteers. Also, a special thank you to you, our wonderful moderator, Justin McElroy. We very much appreciate your contribution to our successful town hall event today. Please remember to vote. So next week, when we learn of the results, you will then know you helped shape our next parliament. Play your part in our vibrant democracy. Please vote early or on September 20th. On behalf of SUCCESS and CIJA, thank you for joining us. We wish you stay safe and a very good evening. Shalom.